Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. I'm Boaz, and Brian and I are very excited today to welcome Michael Wolfe, another philosophy professor in sort of the series that we're doing in talking to philosophy experts around the country. Michael is a tutor at St. John's College, and he was also a graduate of St. John's. He focuses, as he did in his PhD in Columbia and still today, on Islamic studies, and in particular, Ibn-al-Arabi. And we're really curious to fit that perspective into the sort of cognitive model that we've been slowly trying to paint on the wall. So, Michael, welcome.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for having me.
it's lovely to have you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and what you're excited about?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I graduated from St. John's College with a bachelor's degree in 1994. And I went off from St. John's to grad school, not knowing exactly what I was going to study within the realm of religious studies. I knew I wanted to do religious studies. And I had a sense I wanted to explore things that I did not have the opportunity to study at St. John's. St. John's, the undergraduate program, is limited to Western classics as we define it. And the way we define it excludes Islamic texts, and certainly also Indian and Chinese and Japanese texts. And I wanted to go down those rabbit holes that were not provided to me by St. John's. I came back to the college and I've been teaching at St. John's since 1999. And so in the meantime, I'd gotten an interest in Islam, and particularly Sufism and Ibn-al-Arabi. So I brought that with me back to the college, and I felt the lack of Islamic texts at the college. And for years, I've been, and I'm not the only person who has been thinking about this. How might we introduce Islamic texts at St. John's? And so, together with colleagues of mine, students, other people with a relationship to the college, having these conversations about how we might bring Islamic texts to the college. For me, this started early on, around the turn of the century. Here we are in 2025, and we are now at last introducing a new program, a Master of Arts program in Middle Eastern Classics. We just launched it. I'm teaching the seminar together with Krishna and Venkatesh. The two of us are leading the seminar. We're having a great time. Those conversations are rich, and there's a kind of thrill in the classroom because we know we're doing something we've never done before. It's very exciting. It's taken a long time, though, to define it. And the way we have defined it has been predominantly Jewish and Islamic texts. Jewish and Islamic texts. Students who are enrolled choose between studying classical Hebrew and classical Arabic. And in you might, I think you have some familiarity with the Eastern Classics program that we have, where we study Indian, Chinese, and Japanese texts, and so we modeled our program on that. It has the same structure. In the Eastern Classics, students choose between studying Sanskrit and Chinese. And with Middle Eastern Classics, it's Hebrew and Arabic. But while they resemble each other, I want to highlight a real difference between the Middle Eastern Classics and the Eastern Classics. With Eastern Classics, we really are studying different traditions. It's a different line of thought. And you could trace, with Buddhism, for example, from India to China to Japan, and certainly had an influence on some of the later European texts, but it really is a matter of two different traditions intersecting. And I would say this is different from the Middle Eastern Classics because what we're doing with the Middle Eastern Classics program, although it looks as if it's another separate tradition with its own integrity, I think it's a piece of the Western tradition that we've just neglected at St. John's, and we felt uh, we felt the absence of it. We see glimmerings of it if we're reading Thomas Aquinas, if we're reading Dante, if we're reading Cervantes, we're reading Don Quixote, and we know that the Islamic tradition is in the background and comes up in explicit ways. We find ourselves when we go through the undergraduate program wondering about this tradition that's there. We know it's there. Why are we not talking about it?
Yeah, I think that's was one of the big ahas that I've had just recently was when I heard that Heraclitus and Pythagoras both spent a lot of time in Persia
Yes,
and that they were actually influenced by Zoroastrianism.
yes,
And I think that one of the big untold secrets in Western philosophy is that if it wasn't for not just the Islamic world, but if it wasn't for the thirst for knowledge that was happening, this like a renaissance that happened in the Middle Eastern world,
yeah,
we wouldn't have Aristotle.
that's right.
Like it literally, we re-inherited our own traditions because
That's exactly right.
we didn't have the juice together to keep our grasp on them, but the Islamic world was on the ball, and that was I think that's one of the big untold secrets is that there was a vacuum for knowledge that was going on that really was a flowering and a blossoming culturally that we know nothing about, and
I
that
wonder
some of these go
if
ahead.
there are some examples of the seeds of ways of looking at the world and explaining meaning and things like that that occurred in this Islamic Renaissance that you're referring to that kind of might have predated or even caused Aristotle's breakthroughs.
I think the big one that everybody knows firsthand is algebra. that, that sort of came out of that flourishing of knowledge. But go ahead, Michael, please.
No, that's right. I want to make sure I'm understanding your question correctly, Boaz. We're talking about the reintroduction of these ideas to Christian Europe. Is that what you're asking about?
Well, maybe that's it. What I'm getting at is the statement Brian made that we wouldn't have Aristotle if we didn't have this Islamic Renaissance, and I saw you nod
Yeah.
in agreement. So I just want to understand that better.
Oh, yeah. I think what Brian is referring to is the preservation of these texts and engagement with these texts, and not simply reading them and preserving them, but responding to them, building on them. And it comes back, really obvious places with Thomas Aquinas. And in Thomas Aquinas, you see this articulation of a difference between essence and existence. And he's doing this. Thomas Aquinas is building largely on Aristotle, but that particular way of framing it, essence versus existence, is not straight from Aristotle. It comes from the way Muslim philosophers and theologians worked with Aristotle to work out that distinction.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things that surprised me when I started looking into the early Middle Eastern philosophers was the degree to which they were discussing Aristotle.
That's right.
I mean, that was like, wait a minute, this is this familiarity in a way that they sort of carried on that tradition when the West was having other issues sort of at the time.
Right. And you're right, Brian, about algebra, mathematics in general, astronomy, things like this. There was a time in Christian Europe, if somebody were a serious mathematician, they would have to learn Arabic. They would have to learn Arabic to read these texts, or many of these texts, not all of them. And it's interesting which ones were translated and which weren't, but many of them were translated into Latin, and they took on Latin names. So Ibn Rushd becomes Averroes, Ibn
Averroes.
Sina becomes Avicenna, and then you've got these, and so they came into Europe in Latin. Uh, what's interesting is that they're very important texts within the Islamic tradition that never get translated. And Ibn-al-Arabi, for example, is just Ibn-al-Arabi. He's got an Arabic name. Why does he not have a Latin name? Christian Europe had no interest in it. Although I would say that there's nobody more important in Islamic thought from the latter half or the um, last millennium of Islamic thought. There's nobody more important than Ibn al-Arabi.
Which is why they call him Sheikh el-Akbar.
That's correct. Yeah, the greatest of masters, the greatest
of the masters.
That's right.
So I wanted to ask Michael, maybe you could tell us a little bit about why Al-Arabi is the master. What does he represent in
Yeah.
kind of in the lineage of thought?
I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about the importance of Sufism in general, which means Islamic mysticism. And I've got qualms about the word mysticism, but as shorthand, it's a good place to start. It's useful to use that term while um, I don't entirely like that word, but it's useful to distinguish between mysticism and a rational approach. And Ibn al-Arabi belongs to this mystical tradition, and it has a kind of centrality, I think, in the Islamic tradition that we don't see in Christian Europe. We do have Christian mystics, and they're fascinating. Meister Eckhart, for example. Um, but one way of talking about this is, and it's reflected in the curriculum we've designed for this program, is there are these two discrete lines of thought that are kind of bouncing off of each other, responding to each other. The rational tradition or traditions, because we've got philosophy and theology, which are distinct, but they're leaning on the side of rationalism. And then we've got this mystical tradition, Sufism, which has other ways of knowing, that uses faculties other than rationality to know the truth. And they're highly developed. There are a lot of thinkers, if I can use thinker in a broad sense, contributing a lot of ideas. It's a very rich tradition. And what I find really interesting in the Islamic tradition is while you have on the one side figures of Avicenna and Averroes, philosophers, and on the other side you got people like Ibn al-Arabi and Rumi, they end up converging. And in the summer semester of our program, we see these things come together where we have philosophers who are also Sufis and are actually bringing together Aristotle and Ibn al-Arabi in a single system of thought. And so responding to that question, generally, Sufism is important. Why is Ibn al-Arabi the predominant one? That's a hard question to answer, and it starts becoming personal for me. Why is Ibn al-Arabi important to me? Maybe a first thing to say is that Ibn al-Arabi is an ocean without shore. That's his own expression. He's an ocean without shore. He's vast, and he's all inclusive. And people get attracted to Ibn al-Arabi for various reasons, but I think one reason is you get a sense that he is embracing everything, that he gives us a way of understanding everything in a way that I find very persuasive. But also because it's so vast, you constantly have the sense I've only got the tip of the iceberg. You sense the depths, the breadth and the depths of what he's doing.
I want to footnote this vastness. You're not just talking about this in a metaphysical vastness. I mean, this guy, one of his works I think Futuhat al-Makkiyah is 10,000 pages,
It's
and he
huge.
literally wrote hundreds of works. Am I right?
That is correct. That is correct. And I've got a friend who is underway translating the entire thing in English, and my friend is very good, Eric Winkle, and he's moving very fast through it. Um, but he still has a long way to go. It's huge.
And I guess by way of introducing this, I find I've known about Ibn al-Arabi for a while, not in the depth that I have because of preparing for this, but Ibn al-Arabi is really the first mystic text that we've addressed straight on. And I really love Ibn al-Arabi, and that's one of the reasons because of as you speak. I've referred before to within Japanese Buddhism, they make a distinction between Tariki and Jiriki, and Jiriki is my power, and Tariki is trusting others.
Yeah,
And this tradition of my power really means my seeing for myself.
that's right.
And another one of my one string banjo songs is about the difference between propositional knowledge, making truth statements, and dispositional knowledge, which is like being in a state or knowing how to do a thing or knowing how to, I would say to see reality differently is a dispositional shift. And this is kind of why Zen masters try to hit us with a stick. This is why, because they want to shift us somehow
Right.
to give us a direct experience. And then out of this direct experience, we start to say, well, it is as if when we try to come back out of the land of the ineffable and back into, as my Zen master would say, the land of toilets and restaurants, bathrooms and restaurants. um, and these characters, they try to leave breadcrumbs for us, if you will,
Yeah,
about how we can get ourselves into this rarefied, different way of perceiving and relating to the world. And that's kind of what I mean. We've been we've been focused, or I picked up of these thousands and thousands of pages at the end of his life. He wrote this book that's part of the program, the
that's right.
Ringstones of Wisdom, uh, Fusus al Hikam, which is an interesting idea in itself. It was something he wrote near the end of his life, and it is, I guess, what we would call a revealed text.
Yeah.
In that he didn't say, okay, I'm going to write a book. Let's sit down here, get my pen and paper, and I'm just going to write down a book. He actually had a dream in which
Hmm.
Mohammed gave him this book
That's right.
and said, don't mess this up. You know, translate this to people.
Yeah,
And it's fascinating because, one of the things about Ibn al-Arabi, while he was definitely a Muslim, he also said these mysterious things that I think occasionally got him into trouble, if I'm not wrong, saying that you should embrace all creeds because if you don't, you might miss something good, which to me
that's
just
right.
seems like just genius insight, right? Um, but that also this insight that all the paths meet at the top of the mountain when so that each might have something to contribute to you on your way to that place, without not being a Muslim out of all this somehow. I mean, so it seems like there's something universalist about the way because he's basing on this experience rather than a jargon system. Maybe. I mean, what do you think about all that? Just
Well, there are multiple things in what you just said, and maybe we can pluck out and address individually. I think the first thing I want to address that you touched on is different ways of knowing things, ways that are different on the one hand from using your rationality, but also different from simply receiving a tradition and committing yourself to what others have said. That is, it has to be your own contact with this and know it directly. So it's being contrasted with what Ibn-al-Arabi sometimes calls imitators. And he doesn't object to that. You know, you can be a good Muslim, you can follow the teachings, and you're not really bringing your own insights to it. And that's okay. Um, but he really encourages getting into direct touch with truth, and also by contrast with rationality, which is often our way of working out our insight into things. And he recognizes the limitations of that. So if we have imitation, we have rationality. What's the third way of doing things that Ibn al-Arabi is advocating? And he uses different terms, but I think probably the most helpful term to bring in is tasting. That would be the English translation. Tasting for yourself, which is more direct than rationality. It's not a matter of drawing out chains of inferences. You're getting in touch directly with it for yourself. And there's a brief passage in the Futuhat where Ibn al-Arabi talks about eating an apple and tasting the apple, and you know what the apple tastes like, but you can't tell somebody else who's never had an apple what that taste is. You just can't put it into words. It's direct. So that's the first thing I want to address is just what is this other way of knowing. I'm interested, Brian, you're drawing out this distinction between propositional and dispositional. Am I correct? Are those the terms you use? And I want to think about that a little bit. My sense is these two things are thoroughly intertwined and can't be separated. And so what do I want to say? You know, at St. John's, we read books. We talk about propositions. Why is this person saying this? What's the argument being made here? Do I agree with it or not? And that's largely in the realm of propositions, statements that this is the truth, this is what's real. And it needs to be complemented by practices. And you know, initially I'm thinking about something like zazen, contemplative exercises, or you know, Sufi traditions like dhikr. And so I'm thinking about these sort of disciplines where you have to practice and not simply read. But I also want to say you do have to have propositions. There have to be assertions that this is true, this is real. Whether you're saying it out loud, articulating a truth claim or not, the way you live is communicating assertions. This is true, this is not true. I live this way because I take this to be the case. This is the nature of reality. And in addition to contemplative exercises, I would say morality. Morality is not separable from truth claims. And there's a word in Arabic that helps me to think about this. The word is haq, which is often translated as real. And Brian, you've picked up the fusus. You see that in many places, instead of saying God, Ibn al-Arabi will say the capital R real, the real. That's the word haq. So God is equivalent to what is real. But there's another, and we're all familiar with this. If you move from one language to another, we have words that don't exactly match or completely overlap. There are ramifications of this Arabic word that I think we don't have exactly in English. But haq doesn't just mean what's real or what's true. It's also the word for right, as in human rights, or a rightful due, something that is due to me because of my right to it. That's the same word. And I like it because I'm inclined to say that our primary moral obligation is to recognize what is true above everything else. And all of morality, I'm stating this in broad terms, but I think it's true. All of morality begins with our obligation to recognize and acknowledge what is true. And to stem out a little bit from that, um, I'm thinking of something that Simone Weil said that really had an impact on me in Gravity and Grace. Um, Simone Weil says, belief in the existence of other people as such is love. Belief in the existence of other people is love. Or if I put that in my own words, recognition of the reality of other people, that's what love is. And if you're loving somebody, you are recognizing that they are real and that they have a claim on you, that you have an obligation to recognize their reality.
Brian, you won't be surprised. That reminds me of Levinas
That's
and
just what I
the
was going to say.
Absolutely, the face. It's. I think it's the same thing. Levinas appeals to me for similar reasons.
Yeah. And it reminds me of the Quran that says, wherever you look, you will find the face of God.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
there are a
The other
couple of things you touched on there, Michael, that I was wondering if we could circle back to. The direct contact with truth, I think, is it's on one hand an easy distinction between kind of following the rules as or the knowledge as it's handed to you as opposed to pursuing its experience yourself. And Brian mentioned earlier that some great thinkers have left some breadcrumbs in terms of accessing truth directly. I wonder if there's more to be said, either from your perspective or referring back to Ibn-al-Arabi. What um, what methods or what kind of core tenets maybe is better than methods? What are there some core tenets for directly experiencing truth that might surprise us?
so this might be surprising. This is a personal autobiographical response to this, and this was before I even encountered Ibn al-Arabi. But I think what became a turning point in my own uh, journey um, is presupposed by Ibn al-Arabi, I would say. And I think this is going to be surprising when I say it, but it was Descartes for me. I was 19 years old when I encountered Descartes and the meditations. And I'm saying I imagine that's surprising. Nobody likes Descartes. Everybody hates Descartes. And I actually think Descartes was mostly wrong, but when he was right, he was importantly right. And so, just to give a little bit of background and autobiographical context, when I was in high school, for 3 years, I was an evangelical Christian. I was very serious about it for 3 years. And then when I was 18, I lost my faith. And I lost it suddenly, like that. And it's probably not necessary to go into the details of why I lost my faith, but I had this thing that I firmly believed, sincerely believed, seriously believed. And I suddenly lost it. And it left this vacuum. It left me with questions. It left me with a lot of questions. And I had to start all over again. What do I believe? And it was a few months after this, I took my first, I was not yet at St. John's College. I was at a community college taking an sort of intro to philosophy class, and I encountered Descartes. And where this ties into the notion of having direct knowledge, is I think this is the starting place for Descartes. Descartes says, once in your life, doubt everything rigorously, seriously, doubt everything, everything. And he goes through that process until he hits bedrock. And the bedrock is, well, I know that I'm thinking. And when he says thinking, it's not just rational thinking. When I fear, when I desire, I know intimately, directly that I am fearing, that I am desiring. And I cannot deny that. That's the one thing that I know, is that I am presently experiencing, I'm presently, conscious. I think Descartes got everything wrong after that, but I thought that the starting point is absolutely right. And this put me into a position at age 19. Well, if he's got this right, I now have a starting place. Where do I go next? My sense was that Descartes turned left when he should have turned right. And what I mean by that is, what Descartes does next is, he tries to prove the existence of God. And then God is trustworthy, he wouldn't deceive us, and so the world is real, it's not a deception, and he gets the whole world back. My own sense was that after proving that I exist, the next step should have been, you exist, meaning the other conscious mind, the other person should recognize, because there's a real risk you would just end up in solipsism. I'm the only thing that exists. And there's a lot to be said about it, and I'm never quite sure to say what how do I know that you exist, but it's absolutely compelling. We could talk about it in terms of Levinas, the face. There are different ways of talking about it, but I recognize there's another conscious mind, just like me, and the other person. I don't even want to say in terms of he or she. I just want to say you. You know that you exist the same way that I know that I exist. But there's a kind of crisis in that, because there's a way in which we kind of mutually exclude each other. Well, I know I'm real, you know you're real. How are we even coming together into a common reality? And for me, that amounted to a proof of the existence of God. That the only way that you and I can interact with each other as two separate conscious minds is a mind large enough to include my mind, your mind, everybody's mind. And the one other piece of it, um, for me, is I have this sort of tenacious resistance to dualism. I want everything to be reduced to one reality, and I can give reasons for that, but maybe um, just to assert that. To say that there are conscious minds and a material world is a problem. And properly understood, minds and matter are radically different. One can't be reduced to the other. But if I assert that they both exist, then I've got this problem with dualism. I ended up, in spite of Descartes, Descartes didn't want me to end up here, but I ended up as an idealist. I ended up um, not believing in a material world, thinking that I'm convinced of it, that what we talk about when we talk about the world is it's imagination. The term that's used for Ibn-al-Arabi is imaginal. That was the term. That term imaginal was coined to describe that. So this is bringing it back around to Ibn-al-Arabi. I had never encountered Ibn-al-Arabi, but Descartes, of all people, brought me to idealism, brought me back around to a belief in God, a belief that we are pretty literally living in a dream. And then about a decade later, I encountered Ibn al-Arabi, and here is a thinker who who agrees with that, affirms that, and then takes me much further than I ever could have taken myself. to understand the world as a dream and how to understand the relationship between us as individuals and God.
And one of the things that I found that was a big aha for me in reading it, the bit that I did, because there's definitely a lot there. It's some pretty dense stuff.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I would encourage people, if you're interested in this, that there are a lot of resources online of people that will literally help you through this
Yeah.
and help stir the pot, to get all the marrow out of the bones as you do, which I highly recommend. But one of the things that I kept thinking of was of the Baal Shem Tov.
Hmm.
And also lately, I have this thing where I read mystical tradition, and it ends up turning into the first book of the Tao Te Ching for me. And so both of those things are prelude to the topic of names, which is something that I think that modern people don't understand, and modern religious traditions don't really give us a grasp of it. So the connection between names and the Baal Shem Tov and Ibn-al-Arabi, that I think was considered a Baal Shem, if I'm not mistaken, is this idea of a Baal Shem is a master of the names,
Yes.
and somebody who, through the wisdom that they have acquired through the names, can actually like manifest effects in the contingent world. And so
Hmm.
this is kind of a way to address Boaz's question also, is to like, how do we get to this truth? And this is one of the things I love about the worldview of Ibn al-Arabi, which I'll try to lay out, and please fix it if I screw it up. Um,
Hmm.
so we have these two ideas: it's all mind and it's all matter. The mind body problem, as you laid out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it seems to me that Ibn al-Arabi wants to say that, well, God is so multidimensional that if you pick either one of those camps, you miss. And that in fact, it's both of those things, and maybe even something more than. So we have the discussion of pantheism and panentheism. Is there a little more left over? And Ibn al-Arabi seems like maybe he's a little one click past that with the in the mystical direction. But um, so I guess the thing that fascinates me about this name idea is that his picture of the world is, first off, like we met with Spinoza, there's nothing here except God.
That's right.
Which is another understanding of the Quran, where it says there is no God but God, but it's an expanded version of that. There is no anything but God.
That's correct.
There's just God. So, but God needs to, or how do I, God doesn't need anything, but in the experiencing of God's godness, let's say, there is this urge to self experience.
That's correct.
And so, created reality, what we would call contingent, which is an important idea,
Yes.
right? This is this
Yeah.
Buddhist idea of dependent originations. You say you exist, and I say I exist. But when the philosophers have unfolded this, they've said, well, you kind of exist, but your existence really depends on these other things. So, for you to exist, it really pulls these other things in.
Yeah.
And if we start pulling in other things, there's nothing we don't pull in. So you really only exist by virtue of everything existing, the same like everything else. And so Arabi has this idea that God is like the light that shines through a slide, a color slide or a movie film.
That's right.
And and the things that are left out because the film obstructs them allows the places where the light makes it through to be even more highly contrasted, even more
Yeah.
appreciated. So it stands out. And that's where we get into this mystery of names, because one of the names for God is El Haq, the real.
Yeah.
Another one, which we hear a lot about, is El Rahim, El Rahman, right? The
Yeah.
all merciful, the all giving. I like another one that I heard recently, the obvious. But the idea
Yeah,
is that there are these 99 names of God, which is, of
yeah,
course, just a quick way to say infinite names of God, but that each name for God it points out a particular virtue of God that we appreciate when it's not all uh, um, um, I don't want to say muddied up, overshined by all the other virtues of God.
right.
So that the mirror of reality becomes a place where we can actually appreciate and perceive each one of these aspects of God. And then the next part on top of this is that man, because this is what I always want to get back to, this partnership of heaven and earth, man's responsibility has to do with his uniqueness in creation. That because we can speak the names, because we can understand those qualities, we can mirror those qualities more perfectly than the unpolished mirrors of general creation. And
Hmm.
that's where this responsibility to realize God at the highest level comes from, because that is the most perfect way for the Tao of all reality to experience itself the most completely. And that's why all of reality wants us to enlighten ourselves. Did
Right.
I do a good job there to kind of
I think.
sum it all up?
Oh, I think you did an excellent job. There's one thing, and I don't think I'm disagreeing with you, but just to give a little clarification here, is I don't think it's a matter that Ibn al-Arabi is affirming both mind and matter. That is, I think his view is thoroughly idealistic, that really it's all imagination. But maybe a more precise way of articulating it is, what is the relationship between God, um, who in his essence is unitary, and the multiplicity and specificity of the world. So
The
it's less,
contingent
it's
world.
not so much mind and matter, it's unity and multiplicity, or universality and particularity. That's the real problem. And I think you did a great job of talking about this and bringing it down to the level of individual experience and how one relates to God. That is the way Ibn al-Arabi talks about it, is, well, what is the color green? It's white light when it shines through, say, a stained glass window, through that green. It will filter out all the other colors, and we'll just get the green. And then we have a relationship to the particularity of the color green. Ibn al-Arabi is very fond of a statement from an earlier Sufi named Junaid, who says that the water takes on the color of the cup. The water takes on the color of the cup. And Ibn al-Arabi interprets it differently in different places. Sometimes he understands that we are the water, and when we take on the color of the cup is a particular aspect of God. So I'm taking on the attributes of God. But what I find more interesting is when he interprets it the other way around, that God is the water, we are the cup, and the way we experience God is when God takes on our colors, takes on our specificity. That I find very interesting. Um, Another way that he talks about it is, he talks about the heart. He's very serious about the heart. It's not your physical heart. It's also not, in English, I think the heart is typically associated with sentiments, whereas for Ibn al-Arabi, it's a faculty of knowledge. Um, and our heart at any given moment has a particular shape, and God will conform exactly to the shape of your heart. So God is being manifest to us all the time, everybody. We're having encounters with God all the time. Most of the time, we don't recognize it. But God is manifesting to your heart in a particular form that matches the shape of your heart. Now, this revelation that is happening to us all the time, which is very specific, It's so specific that it never happens twice. There's a particular manifestation of God that never ever happens again. So God is revealed differently to different people. And that's what underlies the kind of pluralism and tolerance that Ibn-al-Arabi advocates is that you don't reprimand other people for having different beliefs about God, because God is in fact revealed to this other person in a way different from the way God is revealed to you. And so everybody has a different perspective on God. But also, God does not reveal himself to you in two different moments. Your heart is constantly fluctuating, is the word that he used. It's related to the Arabic word for heart, um, changing moment by moment by moment by moment. And so to be related to God, you can't be related to a fixed idea of God. You have to be constantly on your toes and to recognize how God is revealing, how he's revealing himself to you right now, as opposed to one moment before.
And he has this idea that I found very relevant, this idea of preparedness,
Exactly.
and that God reveals himself itself to us in the shape that is appropriate for our preparedness,
That's exactly right.
which sort of puts the ball back in our court a little bit, as opposed to the idea that God is just grace and God picks some and doesn't pick some, and you're lucky or you're not lucky somehow, like it's a lottery. This says your preparedness is actually has to do with your relationship here.
And with your will and intent, maybe, or like if the revelation of God were only accidental, then that rabbit hole has the no free will argument in it, or at least the precedent. Whereas preparedness implies you can um, take it upon yourself to set the stage for direct contact with truth.
It's complicated. Um, so in a sense, it's true to say that I am determining the way God will reveal himself to me because it's my preparation. It comes from me, and you can't deny it. You're responsible for it. You're responsible for the form that God is taking. But um, what's more complicated is, can you choose your preparedness? Can you choose how you are prepared? Um, and sort of on a deeper level, God is forming your heart, and you're being prepared in a particular way to receive a certain image. And so, from one point of view, and this is, you've seen this, Brian, is Ibn al-Arabi. This is he's very dialectical. He says you can say it this way, or you can say it the opposite way, because both of these things are true, and he'll bounce back and forth. So on the one hand, God conforms to your heart. It sounds as if you've got the upper hand, right? I'm determining how God will reveal himself, but God is forming your heart. So you go a level down. You also say that God is actually forming you and preparing you for a particular revelation. And those revelations, the names of God, um, they're lovely names like the Forgiver. I mean, I'm on board with that. I want a God who forgives. But he's also the one who abases, who will humiliate you. They're very harsh names. The traditional distinction is between the names of majesty and the names of beauty, right? And I wish they were all names of beauty, but they're not. And the world is not all beautiful. It's very harsh. And there's a real, I think, a central question of theodicy. Why would a merciful God create this world that we're living in? And I think Ibn al-Arabi's answer is that these names, these harsh names and these lovelier names, all want to exist. They want to be brought into existence. And so God's most fundamental trait is mercy. And he had mercy on us. We wanted to exist before we were brought into the world. There's something pre-existent or pre-established about us. And we demanded of God, please bring us into existence. And God showed mercy on us by bringing us into existence. He did the same thing with the names. And the name, the one who abases, this harsh name, wanted to exist. And so it's a peculiar thing to say, but it was an act of mercy to bring into existence this harsh name. And it's a
And he he even says that people that commit heinous acts and are punished, in the hereafter, that even that punishment is a manifestation of God's mercy and God's love for the world. Is that
that's correct. And I think Ibn-al-Arabi thinks that all of us, without exception, are destined for mercy and relief from pain in the afterlife. And he says, I'm not sure if it means that people will end up in hell, and hell will end up being pleasant for them, or
right? I
that they,
think
or that they will just be let out of hell. But the end point is everybody comes back to God. Everybody comes back to reconciliation with God. Everybody, without exception.
which is very Hindu,
Yeah. Well, let's.
Bhagavad Gita, like, right?
Yeah, and that's a very harsh form of the Bhagavad Gita. It looks very harsh in the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah.
But to recognize that, and that's a challenge, but to recognize that that is a kind of mercy. The language is a little funny. That Ibn al-Arabi highlights this, that everything returns to God. Everything returns to God. So we're from God and we return to God. But at the same time, he emphasizes the fact that there isn't really a stopping point. There's not a point where you cross the finish line and say, okay, I have arrived at God. That process is actually infinite. You will continue to get infinitely closer to God, but it's like Zeno's paradox. You're never going to finish that. You're never going to arrive at the end point.
The ever revealing face of God.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a ton of stuff in there that I want to ask about. Maybe let me choose one that's always tough for me, because I always backslide on this, so I feel like I never quite grok it well enough. Earlier, I think both of you talked about God's urge to experience Himself,
Yes.
and then it came up again in terms of these names of God want to exist, and I think there's like a volition there, and I think the way I understand um, God's urge to experience self is as an explanation for self-awareness. Like we're self-aware, and that's a good thing because we're part of God or the universe experiencing self. But um, I don't have direct knowledge of God experiencing self, and I wonder if there are any breadcrumbs that could be laid out around this that might give me and maybe some of our listeners some clues about what that really means.
to to have access to God's self knowledge, or am I misunderstanding?
Why do we think that God has an urge to experience self? Why is
Huh.
that part of our cognitive model or of the dream, as you put it?
That's a really good question. Why does God want to experience Himself? It's an excellent question. I'm not sure how to answer it.
I
How
think
do
that typically don't they say that if God was only absolute, that would be limiting. And so
oh,
that for God to manifest a contingent universe is just another expression of even more absoluteness, because that contingent universe will be infinite in its expression of all those possibilities. I'm just,
That's correct, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. So it's an assertion that God wants to experience Himself, to experience Himself in a particular way that could only happen by creating the world. And so Ibn-al-Arabi's language is in terms of mirrors. The created world is a mirror that God holds up for Himself to see certain aspects of Himself that He couldn't see otherwise. Um, Ibn al-Arabi points to an Islamic tradition that God was a hidden treasure and he loved to be known. The verb is love. It's an expression of love. He passionately desires self-knowledge. And yes, Brian, I mean it's he wants to know himself both absolutely and in particulars. But your question, Boaz, I think, and maybe I still don't have a handle on it, is like, how do we know that God has that impetus? And I don't, I think I don't know how to answer that question. How do we know that? You know,
Mystical experience.
sorry.
Mystical experience.
Yeah, but that kind of kicks the can down the road. What does that mean exactly? I mean, the principle that Ibn al-Arabi frequently cites, and it's another Islamic tradition, he who knows himself knows his Lord. And you have to know yourself before you know your Lord. And so those are intimately connected. And it sounds as if what it amounts to is, well, I have this self knowledge, and I have this desire for knowledge to manifest these things, and God has the same thing. But I think your question, Boaz, is, well, like, how do you know? How do you know? And I'm not sure how to answer that.
Well, from what you just said, what I'm taking away is that there's been this thread. You didn't use these words, but fragmentation and coherence, the
Yeah,
particular and the universal,
yeah,
and if we have already concluded that we and our consciousness are fragments of the whole,
yeah.
and of God, then our self knowledge or our desire for self knowledge must be a fragment of
Yeah.
God's desire for self knowledge. So I can cook that for a while and then I'll come back with more questions.
Which is that microcosm, macrocosm, kind of a hermetic idea originally. And I think that there's a thread here that bears at least mentioning, and that is Plotinus and the Neoplatonists. It seems like they had their fingers in the soup here too. And the thing that I've always liked about them was that it seemed that they had a dispositional nature, a series of practices or methods. Because, I always want to put a lot of heavy lifting on the idea of the mysteries with the ancient Greeks. Say, well, the metaphysics, it didn't, it came from realizations that were this. We've mentioned before the idea of intuition, but not meaning picking lottery tickets, more like a direct seeing that doesn't need a inferential process and a conclusion. It's just a direct seeing, like us
Right.
seeing the three angles of a triangle or something. And so I've always sort of felt that the Neoplatonists had this idea, science, a naive understanding of science says that it's telling us, okay, look, and then draw these conclusions. But it really is telling us do this and then look and then draw your conclusions.
That's
And it seems that when Descartes, with no mysteries and no spiritual discipline apart from uh, in a soundtrack of please, 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 hope, 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 uh, he didn't have the basic experiment to run the observation on, because like the Buddhists would say, okay, do this and you'll see you don't exist. Exactly the opposite. And it seems to me that the premise here with Sufis is the practice,
that's right.
and that the practice is actually going to affect, and this is a whole theme for me, the things that we do, that our brain isn't just the thoughts, but that there is an embodiment to it, and that a lot of these practices work with the vehicle to empower and support the process of consciousness. And, we've talked before about use of plant medicines or different fasting methods, and, Native Americans have done different things to open portals, so to speak. And it seems that the Sufis were maybe part of that lineage and maybe coming from the Neoplatonists, or I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Well, there are two distinct things you're bringing up. One is about the relationship between Sufism and more broadly Islamic philosophy with Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism is a huge part of that soup. It's a very important ingredient. But I think more broadly, practice, contemplative practices, whether we're thinking of Neoplatonism or not, are we engaged with contemplative exercises to hone our ability to recognize truth or to have a relationship with truth? And you might have mentioned this earlier, the Sufi image of polishing the heart so it will reflect more clearly. Polishing. What are the practices we do to do that polishing? And and Sufism, the Sufi traditions, because there are multiple lineages, um, are rich with traditions. I mean, there are many different exercises that have been passed down and that are practiced, and they're absolutely central. And maybe this is a little bit of a detour, I've thought a lot over the years about the relationship between what we do at St. John's, reading books, and um, engaging with contemplative exercises, which we don't, except in certain particular ways. Our math class and going up to the board and demonstrating a Euclidean proposition is a contemplative exercise. In our lab class, we have what practica. We have practica. You can't just read um, classical papers from chemists developing atomic theory. You need to go into the lab and replicate those experiments. So we do that in certain ways. Do we have contemplative exercises for when we're reading Plato or when we're reading Plotinus? We actually don't spend much time reading Plotinus, or Descartes, or any philosopher or religious thinker. Do we then say to our students, go and engage in this practice? We don't. That's really that absence of practice is especially stark in the Eastern Classics program when we're reading Dogen, and we're not telling students, you need to go to the Zendo and you need to sit in order to understand what Dogen is doing. We don't
And
do that.
smell the incense.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And so this has become really interesting to me as a question of what it would even look like to complement our readings of philosophical and theological texts with practices, exercises. What would that look like?
I think Brian might be interested in applying for that job if the job description gets written.
Like our new director of labs here, but this version of labs is contemplative exercises. I have
What a
so
sweet
my,
job.
my
That could be.
my thoughts on this, over the last, 12, 15 years, my thought on this has been influenced by another college. I don't know if you're familiar with Dharma Realm Buddhist University in Northern California. It's
I
a
think I might have heard of that.
Yeah, it's called a university. I think it's appropriately called a college. It's a very small college. It's been
Is it
around.
like at the City of 500 Buddhas, maybe?
I think that's right. I think that's correct.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
think that.
And I think it was founded in the 1970s. Um, it's got a monastic side of it. I think there are Buddhist nuns, East Asian Buddhist nuns who live on campus, if I'm understanding correctly. Um, but about a dozen years ago, they wanted to heavily revise their curriculum as a great books college. And so they've come out here multiple times. They have learned from us how to do a great books program. So they've learned from us. They've modeled what they do on us. And what came out of that doesn't look like St. John's. That is that they've brought real innovation to it. And part of that innovation is that they require contemplative exercises. You don't just read books. And we're not only talking about Buddhism. Of course, Buddhist meditation in multiple traditions is highlighted, is emphasized at this school. But they don't only read Buddhist books, they read Western texts. Um, they have made an effort to develop contemplative exercises to complement their readings of Western philosophers and so on. And so I feel that we should think of ourselves as being in the position of learning from them. I think they have learned from us. I think we can learn a lot from them. They drew my attention in my conversations with them at Dharma Realm, drew my attention to a book I was not previously familiar with, Philosophy as a Way of Life by Pierre Hadot. I don't know if you've heard of this book, but he was a philosopher who focused on whatever we can find in the written records of what Neoplatonists and Stoics and Epicureans actually did as a contemplative practice. And he wrote on that. And my understanding is that at Dharma Realm, they looked at that and said, well, this is a model for us. What kinds of contemplative exercises might we recover from the Stoics, from the Epicureans, and so on, so that we're not just reading the Stoics. We're trying to engage with the practices that they actually engaged in. So
I love that.
I'm quite I'm really gripped by that question of how we might bring, I think not in a kind of official or required way, but to make available at St. John's um, opportunities to practice.
Yeah.
I legitimately think bringing Brian on as a consultant to develop something like that
Yeah,
would be worthwhile.
it's a great
Um,
idea.
I'm I want to go back to something that came up earlier that I've kind of been chewing on, if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
Um, so so you talked earlier, Michael, about mind and matter being a duality that's a problem. And as I understand it, you and Ibn-al-Arabi reconciled that through idealism and concluding that this is essentially a dream or a projection. And I don't quite understand how that's not choosing one mind and not the other matter, and how it actually represents a reconciliation. Would you be willing to talk about that a little?
I'm not. I'm not sure I would call it a reconciliation. I think it's choosing one side. It is.
Okay.
That is. I think in my mind, what's being reconciled is not mind and matter. It's mind, or the I think the correct term for Ibn al-Arabi. It's imagination. It's imaginal. Um, there's no such thing as matter. If we understand matter is that which exists when nobody's looking at it, that the rock is still there when nobody is there to experience it. If that's kind of the definition of matter, it doesn't exist. There's no such thing. These things exist only insofar as they are experienced. It is choosing one side over the other. What I think is being reconciled, or what Ibn al-Arabi is striving to reconcile, is unity and multiplicity, or universality and particularity. Um, that's the real wrestling, is to bring these two things together. but it's not. I don't think there's any implication that matter is a real independent thing, independent of our imagination.
Or sometimes might they say immanence and universality or absoluteness, something
Right.
like that, as the
Transcendence
two ends of
and
the
transcendence and immanence.
and eminence. That would be
Um,
it.
um, Similarity is sometimes the word that is used for immanence. And what's the opposite of similarity that he uses? I'm trying to think of the word that's how it's translated into English, but it's essentially transcendence. That God, on the one hand, is utterly different from us. There's nothing we have in commonality with. Nonetheless, God only manifests to us in our own particular form.
And that has to do with, I know he talks about us or maybe contingent reality having a need,
Yes,
having a necessity to rely on this other thing. So that's where the mind would become primary in that respect, because it has no need. God absolute has no need.
that's right.
Uh,
I'm having trouble getting there. Um, Maybe just for what it's worth, I'll share that as close as I can get to grokking that is kind of the idea. I'm in really dangerous territory here because I'm going to talk about quantum physics, which not only do I not understand, but the quantum physicists say they don't either.
But we all
So
want to talk about it anyway. We all want to talk about it.
well, but I think for this reason that I think I at least infer an explanation from my very, very limited understanding. I wouldn't even call it understanding. Um, that matter can exist and not exist at the same time. That matter can be energy and matter at the same time. And that what determines what that energy and matter is in any given infinitesimal moment of time is quantum potential, or I think what Brian has referred to as the is not quite the right word, but the emergent universe. So there's the potential that exists just before now, and then there's now, and in now there is matter, I think. Um, and we don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but if you want to help me understand what doesn't work about that, I'm curious. And if not, we can move on to something else.
So I think I'm going to respond to this obliquely. I'm not going. That is, I'm not a physicist, but I think in these conversations we all want to bring in quantum notions of indeterminants. How we interact with things will impact how these things manifest. I think we're tempted to do it because we respect physics, we respect natural science, so we want to take these philosophical ideas and well, I can point to this because I know the physicists are right. They have experiments to verify these things, and so I want to connect what sounds like an unverified philosophical idea by connecting it to physics. That's very attractive, but I don't think it comes any closer to answering the question. Well, why does quantum physics work? Like we can say that there are certain impacts of the observer on what's observed, but we run back into the same questions again. Um, let me put it this way, and this is going to sound really roundabout, and so I don't know if this is a helpful response. It might sound really oblique. Um, I'm going to bring in Jung. You guys talk about Jung, right? Carl Jung, right? I'm going to bring in Jung here and synchronicity. The idea that you can encounter something in your waking life, here it is, and it directly connects with what's going on with you in your psychology. Um, well, why does that happen? Like, what is the connection between what's going on in your head and what you're encountering, not just in your dream life, but your waking life. What is the explanation? How does that work? I don't know if Carl Jung has an ontological account or metaphysical account for why this happens. Um, but I had a conversation with somebody where we're talking about Jung, and I said, well, doesn't that only make sense if we are idealists? That in fact, what happens in our waking life is in fact a dream. Now I understand why what happens in my dreams when I'm asleep is connected to what happens in my waking life because they're both dreams. I feel as if I've got an explanation then. But the response I got from my friend is, well, it's like quantum physics. Well, you haven't answered anything. You've just given me a different version of the same problem. My inclination, which might be simplistic, quantum physics works because the universe is idealistic. That at root, reality is consciousness, intentionality, teleology, and of course, the observer and the observed are going to interact with each other because it's all at root different aspects of consciousness.
Is this related to the idea of breath? That God has breathed into this dead matter uh, some aspects so that there's nothing that's not got that element that goes beyond matter that is God. Maybe I didn't get that because he's got a whole chapter in there about breathing, right?
It does.
The breathing of life into, which is one of those central mysteries in the chain of being that we've talked about before. Um, is that involved with this? Like it's not dead matter because even the deadest matter has some breath of life put inside of it.
Well, there's no such thing as dead matter. I mean, dead matter just doesn't exist. What?
But is that why? Because of the breath of
Well, yeah, the breath of the All Merciful, which is a particular topic that's really important for Ibn-al-Arabi. Um, it's the act of creation. So
creation.
we get the story in Genesis chapter 2, right? So Adam is formed, and God breathes into this matter and brings Adam to life. For Ibn al-Arabi, it becomes much more general, where the breath of God, the breath of the All Merciful, is breathing the entire universe into existence. It's related
like
to.
an eman- like an emanation in the Neoplatonic sense.
It is. It's quite similar to that, um, and also related to the notion of speaking the universe into existence. So let there be light. So there are different ways of speaking about the same thing. That activity of creating everything. Although I'm going to keep saying it doesn't mean creating matter, but it is a manifestation of this creative impulse. And what I find really engaging for me, this notion that God doesn't have this one moment of breathing the universe into existence and then rests on the seventh day and stops creating, but that at every moment, God is creating the world. And in a really radical way, that moment by moment by moment, or one could say breath by breath by breath by breath, meaning the breath of God. Every moment, the entire universe will will blink into non-existence. Everything will stop existing, and in the next moment will be recreated. And if God didn't keep doing that moment by moment by moment, there wouldn't be anything. So there's nothing self-subsistent about the world. If you stop looking, it disappears. That is, if God stops looking at it and stops working with it, there's nothingness. In a sense, I find that to be an answer to, Zeno's paradox. How do I get? I've got this continuous distance I need to traverse. I'm going to traverse half of that. Before that, I have to traverse half of that and half of that. And it goes on infinitely. And because space is continuous and time is continuous and is infinitely subdivisible, how do you ever get started? And how do you ever finish? How do you ever take that first step? I think Ibn al-Arabi's answer is it's not continuous. It's atomic. It's moment by moment by moment. It's like a flip book or frames of a film. And and I find that to be an interesting account of what is always mysterious to us. What is the nature of time?
Right.
That links up to my understanding of I shouldn't call it understanding of quantum potential and all of the possibilities galvanizing into a particular thing again and again and again. Um, I, if you'll, I'm going to hold off on trying to explain synchronicity in a material universe. Maybe we'll have you back for that, but I need to work on that a little. I think I have something, but I'm not going to be able
I'm
to
really
just.
curious. Now you're going to keep me in suspense.
Yeah, well, you'll have to come back. Um, so there was something else that you said earlier about the idea that God is revealed to everybody in a unique way,
Yeah,
and respecting that all of those manifestations are valid and valuable. I dig that. And there's a danger there
yes,
in, let's say, false prophets, or, in people misinterpreting the revelation, meaning it wasn't a revelation at all. It's some, other ego trip that they're
yeah.
having. Or so how do you reconcile maybe the idea that everybody's revelation of God is valuable, which sounds like a little postmodern, and maybe excessively egalitarian, with the idea that there is a hierarchy of spiritual or mystical experience, or a hierarchy of direct experience of God?
Yeah, I don't know how successfully I can address that. It's a very important question, and so I acknowledge that we should worry about false prophets, or one might make this in Islamic terms. We should worry about idolaters, people who worship idols um, who aren't God, who or notions of a plurality of gods and things like that. There are real dangers in that. Um, but I'll begin by saying that Ibn al-Arabi shows tremendous generosity even towards idolaters. And in the Fusus, in the chapter on Noah, Ibn al-Arabi interprets the way Noah interacts with the idolaters. They worship these specific pagan gods, and they end up drowned in the flood. And in the flood story with Noah, the way Ibn al-Arabi understands it is that the ocean that they are drowned in is knowledge of God. It is a way of knowing God. That through their idolatry, they come to know God. And again, I don't want to brush aside um, the concern that there are dangerous forms of worship. There are dangerous, or what we might call false or idolatrous versions of religion. And yet, Ibn al Arabi recognizes that even in the idolater, that the idolater is relating to God. Even the atheist, and maybe I'm not sure that I don't know if I'm drawing from Ibn al-Arabi here, but I think it's consistent with Ibn al-Arabi. I'm thinking of something that Martin Buber said that has always stayed with me, is that the atheist looking out his attic window um, can be closer to God than the believer who's attached to his false image of God. That the atheist can be closer to God than the believer. Um, I think that
It,
that
it,
yeah. Go ahead.
It seems that Ibn-al-Arabi also is equally happy to say that everybody is a heretic because we're all worshiping some image that we have in our head as opposed to God which we couldn't even conceive of. So the degree to which we envision God, we know, well, that's not it. So as the more we in our petty human
Yeah, yeah,
dimension try to
yeah.
conceive of this appropriate thing, it's always heretical. Even but that's maybe why we need to constantly purify and polish our hearts, so to speak.
Well, it's really tricky. I think you're right. I don't know if you would call us all heretics, but it's implied in what he says that you only worship the divinity of belief. That is the divinity that you have created in your own heart. You create that, you worship that, all of us, and it has that kind of particularity and uniqueness. You can't escape that, and that might look like, I don't know about heretic. Idolatry might be closer. We are all idolaters, and he says that you worship a god that you have created. What's funny about that though is, yes, polish the heart, but I don't think you polish away your specificity. That is, it's inevitable. You will never stop, if we want to call that idolatry, if we want to call it that. You don't ever stop doing that, ever, anybody, because you are a specific created being. You have zero access to God in his own essence, zero access to it. All you have is a particular image of God. And this is where the language of mirrors in Ibn al-Arabi I find really helpful, is that God created us as a mirror for God so that he can look into creation to see himself in a way that he wouldn't see himself any other way if he hadn't created the world. God also is a mirror to us. So we are encountering God. We're looking in this mirror. What do we see? We see ourselves. We don't see God. We see ourselves. So we look in the mirror of God and we see ourselves. God looks at creation and he sees himself. And it's these two mirrors facing each other. And you can't get past it. Ibn al-Arabi is really strong about that, is don't strive to get past the mirror. You can't. You have zero access to what's on the other side of the mirror. You're only going to run into yourself. And that's not a problem. That's how you relate to God.
Because God hides himself with himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can't miss, really.
You can't miss. That's the good news, right? And,
Can't
and
fall out of the universe.
I'm not trying to brush aside the worries, the concerns about ego trips and things like that. I'm not trying to brush that aside, but there is this kind of there's something reassuring, is you can't miss, you can't get it wrong.
That has a teleology to it, I think. That implies a movement. If you can't miss, and maybe your idolatry and going astray is what ultimately leads you to greater coherence in the long run. That implies a trajectory of towards consciousness or towards coherence or something like that. I think you mentioned earlier that's how you see things.
Yeah.
Back home.
Yeah, the eschaton.
Yeah. Yeah. Today's rock and roll reference. Can't find my way home.
Um, I might be complete for now on questions. Brian or Michael, is there anything else you want to bring up?
I've got nothing.
Yeah. The my regular one string banjo songs, which are that we typically we consistently look at these different thinkers, and they're always trying to give us a map of what they've pieced together, trying to make sense of the whole thing, which I always want to say is fundamentally an ontological hermeneutical problem. That is, We're trying to interpret being. And what we tend to do is we tend to look at the contrasting aspects. Say, well, this guy says this, but this guy says this. And what, for me, the great benefit that I get out of this is, and I got in a lot of trouble at St. John's for this, is how what they're saying is the same thing. The big pieces, yeah, they differ in the details, but the big pieces often point in the same direction. And so, in this case, once again, and maybe this is a case of, when you buy a red car, you start noticing red cars everywhere. And so maybe I'm just looking and seeing myself, but
Yeah.
I see the same exhortations of us, uh, an improvability in our ability to experience and parse reality, that we really can get wiser, that there are things that we can learn in life, that as we accumulate experience, it gives us a base to sound meaning out from the world around us. And so when I look at Ibn-al-Arabi, I see a verification. For me, which was very important, was that there are other extra reasonable ways, that is beyond reason, to access information, which doesn't mean you can't fool yourself, but it is kind of this idea that, seek and it shall be found, knock and it shall be opened unto you. Like, seek wisdom and you will get wiser. And I mean, this is again with another one string banjo song about why philosophy is important, why trying to get wiser is important, that your life will be better for it, and it will be more filled with meaning for it. And so I get that message out of everybody that we read. So although I do think that Ibn al-Arabi is this really special expression of it. I encourage people always, to like get your hands on this stuff if you have the
Mhm.
slightest curiosity. There are now, this is why lately I have been like a porcine individual in a pigsty, because the internet really can support your efforts to understand. I know that reading now is like this thing that nobody seems to want to do unless it's on a meme, but honestly, I got through Finnegan's Wake. I get through a lot of difficult stuff because of the support system that the information revolution has provided. So don't get psyched out by this stuff. Like, you can crack these books, and if you aren't getting it, you can find support to get it out. And there's good stuff in there that will help you, that will change your life. So that's my one string banjo song for today, I guess.
And if anybody is interested in learning more about Ibn al-Arabi, it's true. There's an enormous amount of resources out there. Texts are being translated, but there are also scholars. There's been an explosion of scholars of Ibn al-Arabi over the last 50 years or so. The Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi Society. I think they don't say Ibn al-Arabi. Ibn Arabi is how they put it. Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society, which is based in Oxford. It was started, I believe, in the early 1980s, and there were just a few scholars. And then they have a journal that comes out a couple of times a year. And over the last 40, 50 years, young upcoming scholars, and there are a lot of them, they're doing exciting work. And so there's this growing community of people who just love Ibn al-Arabi and want to dive into this, and because it's infinite, and it's very rich. There's a lot to bring up. There are a lot of things out there, and if somebody's curious, I would recommend going to their website and look at their articles. They've got lectures that they've recorded their lectures, put them online. There's a lot out there.
There really
There's a
is.
banquet out there, ready for you to partake in.
Brian,
And
maybe
I'd
we can
also
put that group in the show notes.
we will definitely put the group put the show notes. We'll have that, and anything else, Michael, that you think would be relevant, we'll put in the show notes. You can
Oh,
send that to.
Oh, that's
Um,
great.
and there will also be information about the Middle Eastern program at St. John's,
Excellent.
because I do
Excellent.
want to encourage people to consider that. I do feel like, and this is another one of my little regular rants, is that we are at a special time, and I do think that that we're going to see, instead of fragmentation, we're going to see an energy to glue things back together. That we're at a pendulum swing to come back into synergy. That's why I got in trouble at St. John's. They said, we want you to write analytically, not synthetically.
Yeah.
We want to see what the differences are, not what the similarities are. But anyway, I think that there is this great unification that's happening, and I hold high hopes for philosophy to be as Habermas would say, the usher that shows each of these appropriate disciplines into their seat. And so that's what I'm foreseeing for the future, my hopeful uh, aspirations. Um, Great. It's been really wonderful. And I trust we'll have a chance to do it again.
Yeah.
I
Well,
hope
thanks.
so. Michael, you went deep with us, and I really liked some of the places we went to, and you gave me certainly a lot to think about that I'm going to want to come back and talk about some more. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the conversation again. You've put me in suspense, Boaz, about did I hear it right? A materialistic explanation?
It's not. I don't think it's materialistic. I think it's just allowing for the existence of matter and synchronicity or a collective unconscious. It's and I as I was thinking about how I would present it to you, I heard the difficult question that you were going to ask right away, and so I want to address that myself before I bring it to you.
Yeah. Well, you've got me hooked. You've put out that bait, so I'll come back again. I really want to hear what you have to say about that. But
Great.
yeah,
Thank you.